The excavator's diesel engine roared to life, just as Margaret Whitmore called the Willowbrook HOA meeting to order. Through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, 37 board members and residents watched in stunned silence as the massive yellow machine positioned itself at the edge of David Chen's backyard pool. Margaret's gavel froze midair, her mouth agape, as David's voice crackled through the building's intercom system. "You wanted my pool gone by tonight's meeting? Well, here's your compliance." The first swing of the excavator's arm sent a thunderous crack echoing through the night. And what happened next would expose secrets that would destroy everything Margaret had built. Nandrith had built and reveal why David Chen had been planning this moment for 3 long, bitter years. David Chen stood at his kitchen window, watching the excavator operator perform his final equipment check. The machine's yellow paint gleamed under the floodlights David had strategically positioned around his backyard, casting dramatic shadows across the pristine pool that had become the center of his personal war with the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. "You sure about this, buddy?" Jake Martinez called from the patio, his weathered hands gripping a steaming coffee mug. The excavator operator had been David's friend since high school, and his face showed equal parts concern and admiration. "Once I drop that first load of concrete into your pool, there's no going back." David's reflection stared back at him from the window of 42-year-old software engineer whose patient demeanor had been systematically stripped away over 3 years of HOA battles. His dark eyes held a coldness that hadn't been there when he'd first moved to Willowbrook with dreams of suburban peace. "I'm sure," David said, his voice carrying a finality that made Jake nod slowly. "Margaret Whitmore wanted compliance by tonight's meeting. She's getting exactly what she asked for." The kitchen island behind him was covered with meticulously organized documents, building permits, legal correspondence, HOA violation notices, and architectural approval forms dating back to when he'd first installed the pool. Each paper represented a battle fought and lost against Margaret's relentless campaign to force him out of the neighborhood. David picked up the latest violation notice, delivered just that morning with Margaret's characteristic passive flourish. The crisp HOA letterhead seemed to mock him as he read her words aloud. Final notice: pool installation remains in violation of Willowbrook Community Standards, Section 4.7. Immediate removal required or face legal action and daily fines of $500. Compliance must be demonstrated at tonight's monthly meeting. "She really thinks she's got you cornered," Jake observed, setting down his mug and walking toward the excavator. "What she doesn't know is that you've been planning this for months." David's phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Everything's in place. The board members have no idea what's coming." "Are you ready for this?" he typed back. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." The irony wasn't lost on him. Margaret had spent 3 years trying to destroy his peace, his property value, and his reputation in the community. She'd weaponized the HOA rules, manipulated board votes, and turned neighbors against him, all because he'd dared to install a pool without kissing her ring first. What she didn't realize was that her final ultimatum had handed him the perfect opportunity for the most spectacular compliance in HOA history. David walked outside, breathing in the crisp October air. The Willowbrook Community Center was visible just 2 blocks away, its windows glowing warmly as residents filed in for the monthly meeting. He could picture Margaret in her usual spot, at the head of the conference table, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she prepared to publicly humiliate him once again. "Jake, fire her up," David said, pulling out his phone to activate the building's intercom system he'd hacked into earlier that week. His software engineering skills had proven invaluable in preparing for this moment. The excavator's engine rumbled to life, its deep growl carrying across the quiet neighborhood. Porch lights began flickering on as curious residents stepped outside to investigate the unusual evening construction noise. David had calculated everything perfectly. The monthly HOA meeting always started at 7:30. Sharp. Margaret's obsession with punctuality was legendary. It was now 7:28, which meant she'd be calling the meeting to order just as Jake positioned the excavator at the pool's edge. His phone displayed the live audio feed from the community center's conference room. He could hear Margaret's voice, sharp and authoritative, as always. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We have significant business to discuss tonight, including the final resolution of the Chen property matter. David smiled grimly. She had no idea how final this resolution would be. "You ready for me to start recording?" Jake called from the excavator cab, holding up his phone. "Your lawyer said documentation was crucial." "Start recording now," David confirmed, then spoke into his phone's microphone, broadcasting directly into the community center. "Good evening, Willowbrook, HOA, board members and residents. This is David Chen, speaking to you from 247 Maple Grove Lane." Through the audio feed, he heard the sudden silence that fell over the meeting room, followed by Margaret's sharp intake of breath. "As you all know," David continued, his voice carrying clearly through the building's speakers, "I've received repeated violation notices regarding my pool installation. Tonight, I'm here to demonstrate my complete compliance with HOA demands." Jake gave him a thumbs up and began maneuvering the excavator's massive arm toward the pool. The first concrete slab was already loaded, waiting to be dropped. "Mr. Chen," Margaret's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with barely controlled fury. "This is highly irregular. You cannot simply—" "Actually, Margaret, I can," David interrupted, his tone remaining perfectly calm and professional. "According to Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws, any resident has the right to address compliance matters during the monthly meeting. I'm simply choosing to demonstrate my compliance rather than just talk about it." He could hear murmuring from the conference room as board members frantically flipped through their copies of the bylaws. Margaret's silence stretched long enough for David to know she was trapped. He'd quoted the rules correctly, and she knew it. Jake positioned the excavator arm directly over the pool's deep end and looked to David for final confirmation. The concrete slab hung suspended, ready to drop. "You wanted my pool removed by tonight's meeting," David announced to his captive audience. "You filed legal threats, imposed daily fines, and made it clear that my only options were compliance or destruction. Well, here's your compliance." He nodded to Jake. The first concrete slab dropped with a thunderous crash that shook the ground and sent a massive splash of chlorinated water erupting skyward. The sound echoed across the neighborhood like a gunshot, and David heard several people in the conference room gasp audibly. But that was just the beginning. As Jake loaded the second slab, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret's personal number, the same number she'd used to leave him dozens of threatening voicemails. Over the past 3 years, David answered on speaker, ensuring every word would be broadcast to the meeting. "You son of a bitch!" Margaret's voice was shaking with rage, her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. "You think this little stunt makes you clever? I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace, for destruction of property values, for complying with your demands," David interrupted smoothly. "Margaret, you might want to be careful. Every word you're saying right now is being broadcast to the entire HOA meeting, and I'm recording everything for legal purposes." The second concrete slab dropped, sending another shockwave through the neighborhood. More lights came on, and David could see neighbors emerging from their houses, drawn by the spectacle. Through the intercom feed, he heard Margaret whisper something urgent to another board member. Then the sound of papers rustling frantically. David came a different voice, Robert Hendricks, the board treasurer, and the only member who'd ever shown him any fairness. This is quite a demonstration. But surely there's a more reasonable way to, Robert, with all due respect." "I spent 3 years trying reasonable approaches," David replied, watching Jake position the third concrete slab. "I followed every proper channel, submitted every required form, paid every fee. What I got in return was harassment, legal threats, and a campaign to force me out of my own home." The third slab dropped, and this time David heard something unexpected through the intercom, the sound of someone sobbing quietly. It wasn't Margaret. Her voice was too controlled when she spoke next. "Fine," Margaret said, her words clipped and sharp. "You want to play games? 2 can play that game, Mr. Chen. This meeting is adjourned." "Actually, Margaret," David said, his smile audible in his voice. "According to Section 8.2 of the bylaws, meetings can only be adjourned by majority board vote or after all scheduled business is completed. And we haven't finished discussing the Chen property matter." Jake had loaded the fourth concrete slab and was positioning it over the shallow end. The pool was rapidly becoming an expensive concrete grave, exactly as David had planned. "What do you want?" Margaret's voice was barely controlled. The Willowbrook Community Center had never seen chaos like this. Board members shouted over each other, demanding answers, while Margaret Whitmore sat frozen at the head of the table, her face drained of all color. The intercom crackled with the sound of David's excavator shutting down, leaving an eerie silence that somehow made the turmoil in the conference room even more pronounced. "I want to see those original bylaws right now." Robert Hendricks slammed his palm on the table, his usually calm demeanor shattered. As treasurer, he'd signed off on thousands of dollars in legal fees pursuing David's case, never knowing the foundation was built on lies. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her briefcase. "Robert, please, let's discuss this privately." Privately. The voice belonged to Alina Vasquez, a newer board member who'd been elected just 6 months ago on a platform of transparency. "Margaret, we just heard, you admit to changing the rules retroactively to target a specific resident. There's nothing private about fraud." Through the intercom, David's voice cut through the chaos with surgical precision. "Elena's right. And since we're talking about fraud, Margaret, why don't you tell everyone about the Phoenix construction invoices?" Margaret's face went from pale to ashen. She knew exactly what David was referring to, and the terror in her eyes told everyone in the room that whatever was coming next would be devastating. David had spent the last year not just fighting the pool violation, he'd been conducting a thorough investigation into Margaret's financial management of the HOA. What he'd discovered was a web of corruption that went far deeper than petty power plays over backyard pools. "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction. "Phoenix Construction," David repeated, his tone patient but relentless. "The company that supposedly repaved the community center parking lot last year for $47,000. The same company that has the exact same business registration address as your daughter's apartment in Scottsdale." The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed squarely at Margaret. Board members who had blindly supported her for years suddenly found themselves questioning every decision they'd rubber-stamped. "That's impossible," gasped Helen Torres, the board secretary, who'd faithfully recorded minutes for the past decade. "I processed that invoice myself. Phoenix Construction had all the proper documentation. Business licenses they did," David confirmed. "Fake ones." "Very good. Fake ones, but fake nonetheless. I've got copies of the real business registrations." And Phoenix Construction was dissolved in 2019, 3 years before they allegedly repaved our parking lot. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is over. I don't have to sit here and listen to these baseless accusations. Sit down, Margaret." The command came from Thomas Brennan, the eldest board member and Margaret's most loyal supporter for the past 8 years. His weathered face was hard as granite, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd run corporate boardrooms. "Before retiring to Willowbrook, you're going to answer every question, or I'm calling the police myself." Margaret remained standing, her eyes darting toward the exit. But Alina had anticipated this and was already blocking the door. Her phone in hand. "I've already called them," Alina announced. "Detective Morrison is on his way. He's been very interested in our HOA's financial records ever since David contacted him last week." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. David had been planning this confrontation for months, building an airtight case while Margaret thought she was cornering him with pool violations. Through the intercom, David's voice returned, now addressing the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 3 years, Margaret has embezzled approximately $340,000 from our community funds. The pool violation was never about community standards. It was about driving me out before I could complete my investigation." Robert Hendricks was frantically pulling up financial records on his laptop, his face growing paler with each screen. "David, how long have you known about this?" "I first suspected something was wrong about 18 months ago, when I noticed discrepancies between the budgets Margaret presented and the actual work being completed. The pool harassment intensified. Right around the time I started asking questions about vendor payments, Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "You don't understand. I was going to pay it back. I just needed time. Time." Thomas Brennan's voice was thunderous. "Margaret, you've been stealing from your neighbors for years. We trusted you with our homes, our community, our children's safety fund. the Children's Safety Fund. David had saved that revelation for maximum impact. Margaret hadn't just embezzled general operating funds, she'd stolen money specifically designated for playground equipment, crosswalk improvements, and emergency lighting. Money that families had contributed, believing it would keep their children safe. Helen Torres was crying now, her hands covering her face. Oh God. The ones we said we couldn't afford after the break-ins last summer. Those children were in danger because of you, Margaret. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. She sank back into her chair, her body shaking with sobs. I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just a few thousand, when Richard lost his job. I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed. Richard? Elena's voice was sharp. Your husband's been unemployed. For 3 years, Margaret whispered. We've been living on the embezzled funds, the house, the cars, our lifestyle. It was all stolen from you. The weight of her confession settled over the room like a funeral shroud. These people had trusted Margaret with their most precious asset, their homes and community, and she'd systematically betrayed that trust to maintain a lie. David's voice returned through the intercom, but now it carried a note of something unexpected. Sadness. Margaret, I gave you dozens of opportunities to come clean. Every time you escalated the pool harassment, I hoped you'd realize I was giving you a chance to confess and make restitution. Instead, you doubled down. Outside, the sound of sirens could be heard approaching. Detective Morrison was punctual, just as David had expected. The irony, David continued, is that I never cared about winning the pool fight. I cared about protecting our community. You turned me into your enemy, but I was actually trying to save you from yourself. Margaret looked up sharply. Save? Me. I've been in contact with the district attorney's office for 6 weeks. If you had confessed voluntarily and agreed to full restitution, they were prepared to consider a plea deal with no jail time, community service, probation, and a payment. Plan to return the stolen funds. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Margaret's sobs had stopped as she processed what David was telling her. But you forced my hand, David said quietly. Tonight's spectacle wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure there were enough witnesses that you couldn't claim this was all fabricated. The excavator, the public confrontation, the recording it was all necessary to ensure justice. Detective Morrison entered the conference room, his presence immediately commanding attention. A tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, he surveyed the room with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen every kind of human drama. Mrs. Whitmore, he said simply, we need to talk. Margaret stood slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for her purse. But instead of identification or car keys, she pulled out a thick envelope. I wrote this 3 days ago, she said, her voice hollow, when I realized David wasn't going to stop investigating. She handed the envelope to Detective Morrison. It's a full confession. Every stolen dollar, every falsified invoice, every lie I told to cover it up. The detective opened the envelope and scanned the contents, his eyebrows raising slightly. This is very thorough, Mrs. Whitmore. It'll make our job much easier. Margaret turned to face the room full of people she'd betrayed. I know you'll never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that living with this guilt has been torture. Every day, watching you all trust me, depend on me, while I knew what I was stealing, ... She broke down completely. Thomas Brennan stood slowly, his old frame showing every one of his 78 years. Margaret, 20 years ago, when my wife was dying, you organized meal trains for our family. You drove her to chemotherapy appointments. When I couldn't get time off work, you were there for us when we needed you most. He paused, wiping his eyes. That's what makes this so heartbreaking. We know you're capable of being better than this. Detective Morrison began reading Margaret her rights, his voice professional, but not unkind. As he led her toward the door, she stopped and looked back at the intercom speaker. David, she said, her voice broken but clear, thank you for giving me chances I didn't deserve. And I'm sorry, truly sorry for what I put you through. The door closed behind them, leaving the remaining board members sitting in stunned silence. Outside, David's floodlights were still illuminating the concrete-filled crater that had once been his swimming pool, a bizarre monument to the most extraordinary HOA meeting in Willowbrook's history. Elena finally broke the silence. David, are you, STI? 3 days after Margaret's arrest, David stood in his backyard staring at the concrete tomb that had once been his pool. The morning sun cast long shadows across the destruction, and he found himself oddly at peace with the sacrifice. What he'd lost in property value, he'd gained in justice and in the information that was about to transform Willowbrook forever. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison. "Can you meet me at the station at 2 p.m.? We need to discuss what you found about Pinnacle Development." David's stomach tightened. Pinnacle Development was the thread he'd been afraid to pull, the connection that had kept him awake for weeks. Margaret's embezzlement was devastating enough, but what lay beneath it was far more dangerous. His doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw Alina Vasquez, still wearing her nursing scrubs from her overnight shift at the hospital. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with determination. "We need to talk," she said the moment. He opened the door. "About what you're not telling us." David stepped aside to let her in, noting the manila folder clutched in her hand. "Elena, you should be sleeping. You just worked a 12-hour shift." "Sleep," she laughed bitterly. "After what happened Monday night, I haven't slept for 3 days. Neither have most of the board members. We keep thinking we've hit bottom, but you keep hinting there's more." She slammed the folder onto his kitchen counter. "So I did some digging of my own. Want to explain why Pinnacle Development has purchased 12 properties in Willowbrook over the past 18 months, all through shell companies?" David's carefully constructed timeline was accelerating beyond his control. He'd planned to reveal the Pinnacle connection gradually, working with law enforcement to build an airtight case. But Elena's independent investigation was forcing his hand. "How did you find that information?" he asked, genuinely impressed, despite his concern. "I'm not just a nurse, David. I have a master's degree in forensic accounting. It's why I ran. For the board, I wanted to make sure our community finances were properly managed." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Fat lot of good that did." She opened the folder, revealing property records, corporate filings, and financial documents that would have taken David weeks to compile. Pinnacle Development isn't just buying random houses. They're targeting specific properties along a corridor that runs straight through the heart of Willowbrook. David studied the map she'd created, his worst fears confirmed. Alina had identified the same pattern. He'd discovered a systematic acquisition strategy that could only mean one thing: commercial development, he said quietly. "A shopping mall," Alina corrected, her voice tight with anger. "A massive retail complex that would require rezoning half of Willowbrook from residential to commercial. The kind of project that would displace hundreds of families and destroy our community." David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Hendricks, and his voice was shaking when David answered. "David, you need to get over here right now. We've got a problem, big one." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where men in expensive suits are going door to door offering residents cash buyouts for 3 times their property value, and some people are already signing contracts." Alina and David exchanged grim looks. The timeline was collapsing. Completely. 20 minutes later, they stood on Robert's front porch, watching a black sedan pull away from the house across the street. The elderly couple who lived there, the Hendersons, who'd been in Willowbrook for 30 years, stood in their driveway holding what appeared to be a check. "They hit the Hendersons an hour ago," Robert said, his face pale. "Offered them $850,000. Cash for a house they bought for $180,000 in 1995. No inspections. No financing contingencies. Closing in 2 weeks? Let me guess," David said grimly. "The buyers are represented by Pinnacle Development." "How did you?" Robert stopped mid-question, his eyes narrowing. "You already knew about this." David nodded slowly. "I've been investigating Pinnacle for months. They're not just buying properties, they're systematically destabilizing our community to force a mass exodus." Alina pulled out her phone, showing them a news article she'd bookmarked. "They did the same thing to Maplewood Gardens, a community about 50 miles north of here. 18 months of strategic property acquisitions combined with infrastructure problems that mysteriously appeared. Infrastructure problems." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "Water main breaks, electrical grid failures, sewage backups, all conveniently timed to make residents desperate to sell." Elena's fingers flew across her phone screen. The community fought back initially, but Pinnacle had inside help. Someone in local government was feeding them information about planned municipal improvements, helping them time their offers perfectly. David's phone buzzed with another text from Detective Morrison. Meeting moved up to noon. Bring everything you have on Pinnacle. This is bigger than we thought. We need to warn everyone, Robert said, starting toward his car. If people don't understand what's happening, Pinnacle will pick us off one by one. Wait, David grabbed his arm. We can't. Just go knocking on doors, making accusations without proof. That'll cause panic and probably lawsuits. Then what do you suggest? Alina demanded. We sit back and watch our neighbors get conned. David pulled out his laptop, opening a file he'd been preparing for weeks. We call an emergency board meeting. For tonight, full disclosure of everything we know with documentation. We present the facts and let residents make informed decisions. The file contained months of painstaking research corporate records showing Pinnacle's ownership structure, financial documents revealing their funding sources, and most damaging of all, email communications between Margaret Whitmore and Pinnacle representatives dating back to years. Margaret was working with them, Alina breathed, reading over David's shoulder. She wasn't just embezzling money, she was sabotaging our community from the inside. The emails painted a devastating picture. Margaret had been providing Pinnacle with detailed information about community finances, upcoming maintenance projects, and resident concerns. In exchange, she'd received monthly payments disguised as consulting fees money she'd used to maintain her lifestyle after Richard lost his job. But the most chilling revelation was in the final email, dated just 2 weeks before David's pool violation notice, Phase 2 ready to implement. Target resident has been identified as primary threat. Recommend immediate pressure campaign to force relocation. They targeted you specifically, Robert said, his voice filled with awe and horror. The pool violation wasn't random. Harris meant it was part of a coordinated effort to drive you out. David nodded grimly. I made myself a target when I started. Asking questions about the financial discrepancies, Margaret reported my concerns to Pinnacle, and they decided I was too dangerous to leave alone. Alina was scrolling through more documents, her face growing paler by the minute. David, this goes even deeper. Look at the funding sources for Pinnacle development. She pointed to a corporate filing showing Pinnacle's primary investor, Meridian Holdings, a company David recognized immediately. Meridian Holdings is owned by City Councilman James Fletcher, David said quietly. The same James Fletcher who's been pushing for strategic development initiatives in our district. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just corporate greed, it was political corruption at the highest levels of local government. Fletcher had inside knowledge of zoning changes, development plans, and municipal budgets. He could ensure that Pinnacle's mall project would receive fast-track approval while competing developments faced endless red tape. We have to go to the FBI, Alina said. This is way beyond what local police can handle. David's phone rang again. This time it was Jake Martinez, his excavator operator friend, and his voice was tight with worry. David, we've got a problem. Someone broke into my equipment yard last night and sabotaged 3 of my machines. Hydraulic lines cut, control systems damaged. It's going to cost me $50,000 to fix. Did you call the police? Yeah, but they're treating it as random vandalism. But David, I don't think it's random. One of my employees saw a black sedan circling the yard yesterday afternoon, same kind of car you described seeing at the Hendersons. Alina grabbed David's arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. They're escalating. First they tried to drive you out legally, then financially. Now they're going after anyone who helped you. David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. By fighting back against Margaret's harassment, he'd unknowingly declared war on a criminal organization with resources and connections far beyond anything he'd imagined. We need protection, Robert said, stating the obvious. If they'll sabotage Jake's equipment, what's to stop them from targeting our families directly? As if summoned by his words, David's doorbell rang. Through the window, he could see 2 men in dark suits standing on his front porch, their posture radiating menace despite their professional appearance. Alina peered through the blinds. Those aren't the same men who visited the Hendersons. These guys look, she swallowed hard, these guys look dangerous. David's laptop chimed with an incoming email. The sender was listed as a friend, but the message was anything but friendly. Mr. Chen, you have 24 hours to accept HOA. Detective Morrison's unmarked police car pulled into David's driveway at exactly 11:47 a.m., 13 minutes before their scheduled meeting. Through his kitchen window, David watched the detective survey the black sedan across the street with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years recognizing threats. "Friends of yours?" Morrison asked as he entered David's house, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "Pinnacle Development's idea of customer service," David replied grimly. "They showed up about an hour after I refused their buyout offer." Morrison walked to the window and studied the surveillance team with obvious displeasure. License plate runs back to a shell company registered in Delaware. These aren't local muscle, they're professionals. Alina and Robert, who'd remained at David's house since the morning's revelations, exchanged worried glances. The detective's tone suggested they were dealing with something far more serious than corporate intimidation. Detective Alina said, opening her forensic accounting folder, "We need you to see what we've discovered about Pinnacle's operations." Morrison spent the next 20 minutes reviewing Elena's documentation, his expression growing darker with each page. When he reached the emails between Margaret and Pinnacle, he whistled low and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling in federal backup," he announced. "This level of coordination between private developers and elected officials crosses into RICO territory, Rico." Robert's voice cracked slightly. "Racketeering." Morrison's fingers flew across his phone screen. "David, what you've uncovered isn't just corruption. It's a systematic criminal enterprise operating across multiple jurisdictions." Before David could respond, his doorbell rang again. This time, however, the visitor was unexpected. Thomas Brennan, the elderly board member who'd confronted Margaret, stood on the porch looking haggard and frightened. "Thomas, what's wrong?" David asked, opening the door quickly. "They came to my house this morning," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "To men, very polite, very professional. They offered me $900,000 for my house, but when I said I needed time to think about it, they mentioned my granddaughter by name." The room fell silent. Thomas's granddaughter was 8 years old and attended Willowbrook Elementary. Just 6 blocks away, they knew her schedule. Thomas continued, sinking into David's couch. "They knew she has piano lessons on Tuesdays, soccer practice on Thursdays." They weren't making threats directly, but the message was clear. Detective Morrison was already on his radio, calling for patrol units to monitor the elementary school and Thomas's house. This changes everything. Threatening children puts us in federal jurisdiction immediately. David's laptop chimed with another email, this one sent to what appeared to be every resident in Willowbrook simultaneously. The subject line read, "Urgent, Community Safety Notice." "Oh no," Alina breathed, reading over David's shoulder. The email, ostensibly from Willowbrook Community Safety Committee, contained a carefully crafted message designed to spread panic. "Due to recent criminal activity in our neighborhood, including embezzlement by former HOA leadership and escalating property crimes, many families are choosing to relocate for their safety. Pinnacle Development is offering immediate cash purchases to help residents transition quickly to safer communities. For your family's protection, consider this limited-time opportunity." "They're brilliant," David said with grudging admiration. "They're using Margaret's arrest and the recent crimes to justify their buyout campaign. To anyone who doesn't know the full story, this looks like legitimate concern for community safety." Morrison's radio crackled with an update from patrol units. "Detective, we've got multiple black sedans positioned throughout Willowbrook, at least 6 vehicles, all without top state plates. They're not just watching us anymore," Alina realized. "They're monitoring the entire community, ready to pressure anyone who shows interest in selling." David's phone began ringing with calls from neighbors. The first was Helen Torres, the former board secretary, her voice tight with fear. "David, there are men parked outside my house taking pictures. I got that safety email, and now I'm wondering if maybe I should consider selling." "My husband thinks, Helen." "Don't do anything hasty," David interrupted. "Can you come to my house right now? We need to brief you on what's really happening." The next call was from the Hendersons, the elderly couple who'd already signed a contract with Pinnacle. But now Mr. Henderson sounded confused and worried. "David, we got this email about community safety, and now we're wondering if we made a mistake. The buyers want to close in 10 days, but something feels wrong. They're pressuring us not to talk to our neighbors about the sale. Mr. Henderson, do not sign any additional paperwork, and do not give them access to your house until closing. Can you and Mrs. Henderson come over immediately? Within an hour, David's living room had filled with concerned residents, all sharing similar stories of surveillance, pressure tactics, and increasingly aggressive sales approaches. Detective Morrison listened to each account, his notebook filling with evidence of a coordinated intimidation campaign. This is textbook organized crime methodology, Morrison explained to the group. Create fear, isolate targets, apply pressure, and exploit the confusion to achieve their objectives. Alina had been quiet during the testimonials, but now she stood with a new document in her hand. I've been researching Pinnacle's other projects while you were all talking. I found something that changes everything. She handed David a printed article from a newspaper in Ohio. The headline read, "Criminal charges filed in Maplewood Gardens development fraud. Pinnacle Development is already under federal investigation," Alina announced. 3 executives were indicted last month for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering in connection with their Maplewood project. The case is being prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Detective Morrison grabbed the article, his eyes scanning rapidly. This means they're desperate. If they're already facing federal charges, they need the Willowbrook project to succeed, to fund their legal defense and continue operations. Which makes them more dangerous, Thomas observed grimly. Desperate criminals take bigger risks. As if to underscore his point, David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emergency board meeting canceled. Community center has been declared unsafe due to structural concerns. Any attempt to gather residents for meetings will be met with appropriate response. They're trying to prevent us from organizing, Alina said. Without community meetings, they can pick us off individually. David stood, his jaw set with determination. Then we don't meet at the community center. He walked to his back door and opened it, gesturing toward the concrete-filled crater that had once been his pool. We meet here, in my backyard, around the monument to their failure. Detective Morrison shook his head. David, that's exactly what they'll be expecting. Your house is already under surveillance. Good, David replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let them watch. Let them see that their intimidation tactics have failed. He pulled out his phone and began composing a group text to every contact in his address book. Emergency community meeting tonight, 7 p.m., 247 Maple Grove Lane. Subject, fighting for our homes. Come armed with questions and determination. David, Robert said cautiously, what if they try to stop the meeting? Those men outside don't look like they'll just stand by and watch. David walked to his garage and returned with something that made everyone in the room step back in surprise. A video camera set up with professional lighting equipment. Then we make sure the whole world is watching, he said, connecting the camera to his laptop. Live stream on social media, local news alerts, everything. If Pinnacle wants to intimidate us, they'll have to do it in front of thousands of witnesses. Detective Morrison's radio crackled again. Detective, we've got reports of suspicious activity at Willowbrook Elementary. Someone was taking photographs of the playground during recess. The room fell silent. Threatening adults was one thing, but involving children crossed a line that transformed their resistance from civic duty to moral imperative. Thomas Brennan stood slowly, his aged frame straightening with resolve. Detective, I want protective custody for my granddaughter, and I want to press charges against anyone who's been threatening her. Done, Morrison replied. But I need all of you to understand something. Once we formally charge Pinnacle with intimidation and threats, this becomes a full-scale federal investigation. Your lives are going to be disrupted for months, possibly years. Alina looked around the room at her neighbors' ordinary people who'd been thrust into an extraordinary situation. Detective, our lives are already disrupted. The question is whether we fight back or surrender everything we've built here. David began setting up the camera equipment, his movements efficient and determined. The meeting starts in 6 hours. Detective, can you guarantee our safety? Morrison nodded grimly. I'll have federal agents here by 5 p.m. But David, you need to understand after tonight, there's no going back. You're about to declare war on some very dangerous people. Outside, the surveillance team in the black sedan had been joined by 2 additional vehicles, their occupants maintaining a menacing presence that was clearly visible to anyone in the neighborhood. By 6:30 p.m., David's backyard had transformed into something resembling a war room. Federal agents in tactical gear maintained perimeter security, while over 200 Willowbrook residents gathered around the concrete crater that had become an unlikely symbol of resistance. The professional video equipment David set up was broadcasting live to over 15,000 viewers across multiple social media platforms. Special Agent Sarah Chuneau, relation to David, despite the shared surname, stood near the camera equipment, coordinating with her team through an earpiece. The FBI had arrived with overwhelming force: 12 agents, surveillance equipment, and a mobile command center parked discreetly to blocks away. "David," Agent Chen said, her voice calm but urgent, "we've identified at least 24 Pinnacle operatives positioned throughout the neighborhood. This isn't surveillance anymore. This is preparation for something bigger." The crowd gathered around David's destroyed pool included faces he recognized and many he didn't. Word of the meeting had spread beyond Willowbrook through social media, drawing supporters from neighboring communities who'd faced similar development pressures. Alina Vasquez stood at a folding table covered with documents addressing a group of residents who'd already been approached by Pinnacle representatives. "The key thing to understand," she was explaining, "is that their contracts contain clauses that waive your right to legal recourse if you discover fraud after signing." Detective Morrison approached David with his radio crackling urgent updates. "We've got a problem." City Councilman Fletcher just arrived at City Hall with what appears to be an emergency zoning variance for your entire neighborhood. David felt his stomach drop. "Emergency variance? Public safety concern?" Morrison explained grimly. "He's claiming that tonight's gathering demonstrates civil unrest that threatens community stability. The variance would allow immediate commercial development to restore order." The brilliance of the strategy was breathtaking in its audacity. By provoking David into organizing public resistance, Pinnacle had created the exact justification they needed to accelerate their takeover through legal channels. Agent Chun's earpiece crackled with an update that made her face go pale. "David, we need to evacuate this gathering immediately. Our surveillance team reports multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. This looks like a coordinated operation." But even as she spoke, it was clear that evacuation was no longer possible. The crowd had grown to nearly 300 people, and more were arriving every minute. The live stream had attracted media attention, with news vans from 3 local stations setting up across the street. "If we run now," David realized, "Fletcher wins by default. The emergency variance passes unopposed, and Pinnacle gets everything they wanted." Thomas Brennan, who'd been quiet throughout the evening, suddenly stood on one of David's patio chairs to address the crowd. At 78 years old, his voice still carried the authority of his former corporate leadership. "Friends and neighbors," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. 60 years ago, I served in Vietnam. I learned something there about fighting for what matters." He paused, looking directly at the surveillance positions visible on the neighborhood. "Perimeter. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even when the odds are against you." The crowd fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "Tonight, we're not just fighting for our property values or our quiet streets," Thomas continued. "We're fighting for the principle that ordinary citizens shouldn't have to surrender to criminals. Just because those criminals have money and political connections." Agent Chen was receiving rapid updates through her earpiece, her expression growing more concerned by the minute. "David, whatever you're planning to do, you need to do it now. We've got reports of Fletcher's emergency council session starting in 30 minutes. David stepped onto his back deck, looking out over the sea of faces illuminated by the camera lights. The live stream viewer count had climbed to over 40,000, with comments pouring in from supporters across the country. 3 months ago, David began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "I thought my biggest problem was an HOA that wanted me to remove my swimming pool." He gestured toward the concrete-filled crater below. "I never imagined that pool would become the key to exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatens everything we've built here." He pulled out his laptop, connecting it to a large screen Alina had positioned for the crowd to see. "Tonight, I'm going to show you documents that prove Pinnacle development." in coordination with City Councilman Fletcher, has been planning the systematic destruction of our community for over 3 years. The first document that appeared on screen was an internal Pinnacle memo dated 18 months earlier. Phase 1, identify community, leadership, and neutralize through financial pressure. Target, Margaret Whitmore, HOA president. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they realized the true scope of Margaret's involvement. Margaret wasn't just embezzling, David explained. She was being paid to create instability and drive down property values in preparation for forced buyouts. The next document was even more damaging. A text message exchange between Fletcher and a Pinnacle executive discussing accelerated timeline due to federal investigation pressure. Councilman Fletcher knew about the federal charges against Pinnacle, David announced. He's been helping them rush this project because he knows their organization is about to collapse. Agent Chen's radio suddenly erupted with urgent chatter. All units, we have multiple vehicles converging on location. Repeat, this is not a drill. But instead of the expected confrontation, something unexpected happened. The approaching vehicles weren't filled with Pinnacle operatives. They were news vans, police units, and cars carrying more supporters who'd been following the live stream. The crowd had grown to over 500 people, and the story had been picked up by national news outlets. What had started as a neighborhood meeting had become a focal point for communities across the country dealing with similar corporate intimidation. David's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized. City Hall. Mr. Chen, came Fletcher's voice, tight with barely controlled rage. You need to disperse this illegal gathering immediately, or I'll be forced to declare a public emergency. David put the phone on speaker so the crowd could hear. Councilman Fletcher, thank you for calling. The FBI would like to speak with you about your relationship with Pinnacle Development. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Fletcher's voice returned, but now it was different, desperate, panicked. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Chen. These people don't just steal money, they destroy lives. If you don't back down, you're putting everyone at that gathering in danger. Agent Chen stepped forward and took David's phone. Councilman Fletcher, this is Special Agent Chen with the FBI. Are you stating that you have knowledge of specific threats against the residents of Willowbrook? I know. I'm simply warning about the potential for civil unrest when communities resist necessary development. Sir, I'm going to need you to report to FBI headquarters immediately for questioning. Your cooperation in this investigation is no longer optional. The phone went dead, and the crowd erupted in cheers, but David knew the victory was temporary. Fletcher's warning about Pinnacle's willingness to destroy lives suggested they were prepared to escalate beyond legal intimidation. As if summoned by his thoughts, Alina appeared at his side with her tablet, her face pale with shock. David, you need to see this. I've been monitoring Pinnacle's communications through the public records I filed. She showed him an email that had been sent just minutes earlier. Willowbrook, Phase 3, authorized. Implement contingency protocols immediately. Maximum pressure, all targets. Phase 3, David asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. According to the documents I found in their previous cases, Alina said quietly, Phase 3 is when they stop trying to buy properties and start creating unavoidable circumstances that force residents to abandon them. Agent Chen's earpiece crackled with an urgent update that made her grab David's arm. Gas leak reported at Willowbrook Elementary. Evacuation in progress. Second gas leak at the community center. Third at the water treatment plant. The crowd fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic sabotage designed to make the neighborhood uninhabitable. David looked out over the faces of his neighbors, people who'd trusted him to lead this fight against forces more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The live stream viewer count had climbed to over 100,000, and messages of support were pouring in from across the country. But support wouldn't stop gas leaks or protect their children from whatever Pinnacle planned next. Ladies and gentlemen, David announced to the crowd and the watching world, Pinnacle Development has just declared war on our community. They're using industrial sabotage to force us from our homes. He paused, looking directly into the camera that was broadcasting their plight to the world. But here's what they didn't count on. We're not alone anymore. This fight isn't just about Willowbrook, it's about every community facing corporate intimidation and government corruption. Chen was coordinating emergency response teams through her. 48 hours later, David Chen stood in the same backyard where his swimming pool had once been, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. The concrete crater was now surrounded by FBI evidence markers. News, satellite trucks lined every street in Willowbrook, and his modest suburban home had become the epicenter of what media outlets were calling the largest municipal corruption investigation in state history. The gas leaks had been confirmed as sabotage, sophisticated work that required inside knowledge of the infrastructure systems. But Pinnacle Development had made a fatal error. The sabotage was so extensive and coordinated that it proved federal jurisdiction beyond any doubt, triggering a massive FBI response that caught the criminal organization completely off guard. Agent Chen approached David with a tablet displaying the morning's news headlines. Federal arrests in Willowbrook development fraud, city councilman charged with racketeering, nationwide corporate intimidation network exposed arrests so far, Agent Chen reported with satisfaction. Pinnacle executives, local officials, and what appears to be a network of contracted intimidation specialists operating in 12 states. David scrolled through the coverage, still struggling to believe how far their small neighborhood fight had reached. CNN was calling it a case study in grassroots resistance to organized crime, while the Washington Post had published a detailed investigation into similar corporate takeover schemes nationwide. "What about Fletcher?" David asked, singing like a canary, Detective Morrison said, joining their conversation. Turns out, he was never the mastermind, just a corrupt politician who got in over his head. The real power behind Pinnacle was a consortium of international investors using American real estate as money laundering operations. Alina Vasquez emerged from David's house carrying her laptop, her forensic accounting skills having made her an unofficial consultant to the FBI investigation. "David, you need to see the final numbers. The total fraud across all of Pinnacle's operations, we're talking about $340 million in stolen community funds, fraudulent property deals, and laundered money." The scale was staggering. What had started as David's investigation into a few $1,000 in HOA discrepancies had uncovered a criminal network that had been stealing from communities. Across multiple states for over 5 years, Thomas Brennan walked carefully across the yard, his granddaughter's hand in his 8-year-old Sophie. Brennan had become an unexpected symbol of the community's resistance when her grandfather's protection had sparked the federal intervention. That saved Willowbrook. "Mr. Chen," Sophie said with a serious tone, "only children can manage. Grandpa says you're a hero because you wouldn't let the bad people win." David knelt down to Sophie's level, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. "Sophie, I just tried to protect my neighbors. Real heroes are people like your grandpa, who was brave enough to ask for help when his family was threatened." The truth was more complex than heroism, though. David had spent sleepless nights wondering if his stubborn refusal to back down had put everyone in unnecessary danger. The gas leaks could have killed people, and Pinnacle had demonstrated a willingness to escalate that went far beyond normal corporate corruption. Jake Martinez approached from the street, where he'd been talking to reporters about the equipment sabotage that had first alerted them to Pinnacle's willingness to use violence. "David, there's someone here who wants to meet you." The someone turned out to be Margaret Whitmore, accompanied by her court-appointed attorney and looking like she'd aged a decade in the past week. Her usual perfect appearance had been replaced by exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Margaret," David said carefully, unsure what to expect from this encounter. "I came to apologize," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "And to thank you, thank me." Margaret's attorney spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation with the federal investigation has resulted in a plea agreement. She served 18 months in minimum security, with credit for her assistance in exposing the larger conspiracy." "David," Margaret said, her eyes filled with tears, "when I started taking money from Pinnacle, I told myself it was temporary. Just enough to keep our house, to maintain appearances until Richard found work." She paused, struggling with the words. "But they owned me after that first payment. Every month they demanded more information, more cooperation. When you started investigating, they told me to destroy you or face exposure myself." The confession was painful to watch. Margaret had been trapped in a criminal conspiracy that had gradually consumed everything she'd once stood for. The pool harassment, the violation notices, the legal threats they gave me scripts to follow, deadlines to meet. They said, if I could force you to sell, it would solve both our problems. Margaret looked directly at David. I never realized they were planning to destroy the entire community, I thought. I thought it was just about getting rid of one troublesome. Resident Alina stepped forward, her voice surprisingly gentle. Margaret, the federal agents, told us about the threats against you and Richard. We know Pinnacle wasn't just paying you, they were blackmailing you. Margaret nodded, tears flowing freely now. When you wouldn't give up, they started threatening. Richard directly, they said they'd frame him for crimes he didn't commit, destroy any chance he had of finding work again. She looked around at the neighbors who'd gathered to listen. I was so scared, so desperate, that I convinced myself you were the enemy. David felt the anger he'd carried for 3 years beginning to dissolve, replaced by something more complicated understanding, perhaps, or at least recognition, of how ordinary people could be corrupted by extraordinary circumstances. Margaret, he said quietly, Pinnacle destroyed dozens of communities before ours. They had practiced manipulating people, creating impossible situations. You weren't their first victim, and you wouldn't have been their last. Thomas Brennan spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through enough to understand human complexity. Margaret, you made choices that hurt people, but you also made the choice to cooperate with the investigation, even knowing it would mean prison time. That took courage. Majin Chen's radio crackled with an update that made her smile. Final. Arrests completed in Phoenix. Pinnacle Development officially ceased operations as of 1 hour ago. The news rippled through the gathered crowd like a physical wave. Children cheered, adults hugged, and even the reporters seemed caught up in the emotion of the moment. But David found himself looking at the concrete-filled crater where his pool had been, thinking about the cost of victory. His property value had been damaged, his peaceful suburban life was gone forever, and his family had endured weeks of stress and fear. Alina seemed to read his thoughts. David, you know they're going to want to turn this place into some kind of monument to community resistance, right? The concrete crater that started a revolution. Actually, Agent Chen interrupted with a grin. The federal asset forfeiture from Pinnacle's accounts includes a victim compensation fund, Mr. Chen. You're looking at enough money to build the most spectacular swimming pool in suburban history. David laughed for the first time in weeks, a sound that carried across the yard and seemed to lighten the mood of everyone present. You know what? I think I'll keep the crater exactly as it is. Let it remind everyone that sometimes you have to destroy something precious to protect something more important. Sophie Brennan tugged on David's sleeve. Mr. Chen, what's more important than a swimming pool? David looked around at his neighbors Alina with her fierce determination to protect community finances. Thomas with his willingness to risk everything for his granddaughter's safety, Robert with his quiet strength in supporting the investigation. Even Margaret with her ultimate choice to do the right thing despite the personal cost. Community, Sophie, family. The idea that ordinary people can stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful those bullies think they are. Detective Morrison approached with a final update. David, the district attorney, wants to know if you'll testify before Congress. Apparently, your documentation methods and community organization tactics are being studied as a model for fighting organized crime at the local level. David looked one more time at the concrete crater that had become a symbol of resistance, then at the neighbors who'd become his closest friends through shared struggle. Tell the district attorney I'll testify, he said finally. But only if they understand that this was never about one man fighting corruption. This was about a community that refused to surrender. As the sun set over Willowbrook for the second time since their victory, the satellite trucks began packing up and the FBI agents started closing their investigation. But the bonds forged in the fight against Pinnacle Development would last forever, and the concrete crater in David Chen's backyard would remain not as a monument to destruction, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices. The pool was gone, but the community was stronger than ever. And in the end, that was worth more than any swimming pool could ever be. Margaret Whitmore was led away to begin serving her sentence, but she paused at the gate to look back one final time at the neighborhood she'd both betrayed and ultimately helped save, David.